For me, painting a rainy day scene is really about trying to capture the effects that all the raindrops have on the environment that they're falling on. So, in this video, I'll break down how I used watercolors to paint this scene. Okay, so let's just get started with the obvious. I picked a reference photo with a person walking with an umbrella. That's a dead giveaway that this is a rainy day scene. And I'm all about the idea of setting ourselves up for success. Creating art should be fun and fulfilling. And if it takes picking an obvious photograph to help us get that much closer to painting something that we can be proud of and further our progress, then why not? So if you're setting off to practice a rainy day scene, I say pick one where it's obvious that it's raining. For this painting, I decided to just go for it with paint, without any sketch or preliminary lines. You can see that I did a practice sketch prior to the painting, and I'm also painting right next to my practice sketch, which I found helpful to have as a reference. So if you'd like to see the practice sketch for this scene and hear about why I find sketching to be helpful prior to painting, I'm going to leave a link to that video here and in the description box below. I taped off the border of the painting since painting a rainy day scene really calls for wet on wet technique. So I wet the entire area with clean water, and the first step was to notice where most of the distant and blurry parts of the painting are. Usually this is going to be in the background. This photograph makes it easy to distinguish between the background and the foreground, so everything else really for me besides the figure is basically the background of the painting. So within the background itself, there's a variation between what's furthest away, and I'll typically concentrate on leaving those the most blurry and the lightest in color. And as the paper dries, I'll layer on darker values and blurry details within the background. So at a certain point, when I feel like I have more control, but while the paper and the paint is still wet, there's time to do things like lift and refine little details. So you'll see me do that when I'm lifting out these little spots of white or little streaks that might reference rain or just movement in the atmosphere. I want to keep most of the background very soft yet defined. So you can see that many of the marks I'm making for the buildings are using big brush strokes and being really okay with it being imperfect. Even though the reference photo shows really hard lines, because obviously these are built elements, I'm purposely allowing those architectural elements to be soft and blurry since it's really not the focus of my painting. There are, however, certain little areas that I will pick and choose to create hard edges in the background because it really helps, I think, to provide a little bit of contrast between the blurry edges and the hard edges, but I try to keep them soft the farther away they are and lightest the farther away they are, even if the lines are hard edges. So you can see I kind of blur out some edges, but then I make some edges hard. And then as I move more towards the foreground, maybe more like closer in line to where the figure is, those lines are going to get darker, a little bit more defined, a little bit harder edged. But it's, I think it's a combination or a balance between some of them being hard and some of them being not, as compared to what you would see in real life where everything is really a hard line. So part of this is interpretive, and it's just something that I found works for me or that I felt like doing in the moment for this particular painting. So hopefully that helps you get an idea of my mindset as I'm going through this. Now that all of the details for the background are complete, I'll dry the entire painting and then work on the foreground or the focal point of this painting, which is the figure. So since the painting is now dry, everything I paint here is really mostly wet on dry. The figure has crisp edges and I have time to work on details and take it a little bit slower with figuring out the proportions for the figure. Now this is tricky, especially if, for example, you're more used to having pencil lines or a sketch to go off of, because it is tricky for me too because I don't have pencil lines underneath, so I'm really freehanding it with the help of the sketch that I have on the left and with that practice that I got from doing the sketch. So while I'm doing the umbrella and while I'm painting the figure, I'm also dropping in areas of wet on wet. So you can see that most of it's wet on dry, but within that wet on dry area, I'm still adding wet on wet details. To create the reflection, I'm going to re-wet the area so I can drop in paint later on to create a mini wet on wet area so that the reflection will have soft edges, which you'll see in a little bit. It's the small details at this point that are important to notice for where to protect the whites, where to put in some darks, and just as an example, between the top of the shoe and the reflection on the ground, it's important to protect that area of white on the paper because it's going to be those little things that inform our brains of what's going on. Like the foot is lifted off the ground, this person is walking, and little bits and areas within the figure as well. They might not be able to be defined like, oh, that's the hand or this is the elbow. It's really for me abstract at this point, but what I'm looking at are the differences in color and value and the protection or the saving of the whites in these little pockets that creates the feeling that there's fabric and folds. And, obviously there's the bag there that is a dark black rectangle, but I think that it's just these little bits and pieces of color. So I really look at the image and try to translate the values into marks onto paper rather than trying to name all the pieces that I'm trying to paint. Lastly, if I've lost any of the whites, then I give myself permission to come back and use white gouache or white watercolor straight out of the tube to add back in any tiny spots. So you can see that I'm just adding in some of the markings for the signage, some bright spots on the figure, and just cleaning up any small details at this point. And basically, in summary, the way that I approached this painting with watercolor was really to use wet on wet technique to create a misty background and reflections. I used lifting to create soft markings and white spots that helps contribute to the feeling of that rainy texture. And then I came back in with wet on dry to create hard edges where the focus of the painting was. So I hope that watching my process for this rainy day scene was helpful. The reference photo is linked in the description box below, along with all the supplies I used in case you want to give this a try yourself. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me in the comments. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.